Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are setting a course straight for, well, one of the most notorious figures in 20th century French thought, Michel Foucault.
It's a journey worth taking, for sure, but we definitely need to approach it with some caution. I mean, Foucault's work is probably one of the most frequently cited and at the same time most misunderstood bodies of thought out there.
Absolutely. And our mission today isn't just to give you a summary of his big projects, prisons, sexuality, madness. We want to do a deep reconstruction of his underlying methodology.
His logical reasoning, really.
Exactly. We want to address that classic, really damaging critique that's haunted his legacy for decades.
You're talking about the claim that he's just an unconstrained relativist.
That, or even worse, an epistemic nihilist, the idea that for Foucault, nothing is really true.
Right, and that critique was leveled pretty powerfully by thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, Richard Rorty back in the late 20th century. Their argument was, essentially, if Foucault says all knowledge is just an effect of power.
That truth is just what a certain group in power says it is at a certain time.
Then his whole project collapses into methodological incoherence. It just doesn't hold up.
It's a really foundational problem, right? If power is what determines knowledge, then Foucault's own historical descriptions, his claims about how the prison system was invented, for instance.
They must also be just products of power.
Which would make them just as arbitrary as the systems he's critiquing. So why should we believe Foucault's version of history is true if he seems to be rejecting the very idea of objective truth?
And that challenge, it really stopped productive engagement with his work for a lot of years. It forced scholars into this constant defensive posture. But the argument we're digging into today is that this whole critique comes from a basic mistake.
A mistake in how we categorize his work.
Exactly. The critics were trying to read Foucault through the lens of traditional normative epistemology.
Okay, let's pause on that. Normative epistemology, what were they actually looking for from him?
Well, traditional normative epistemology is all about finding a timeless, universal standard, a set of rules or criteria that lets you distinguish truth from falsehood, across the board, in science, in morality, everywhere.
So they wanted Foucault to give them a universal principle, something like truth is what corresponds to reality, and then justify his claims using that principle.
Foucault just wasn't playing that game at all.
So what was his game?
His project isn't epistemology in that sense. It's a historico-critical project. His whole inquiry is about the historical conditions that made knowledge and experience possible in the first place.
So he's asking questions like, under what weird contingent historical circumstances did this particular way of knowing something become, a thing?
Precisely. Like, how did we get from classifying someone as a lawbreaker to classifying them as a delinquent? With this whole psychological backstory. He's analyzing the specific historical rules of the game, not trying to establish the universal rules of reality itself.
I see the distinction. He's not defining what truth is for all time. He's describing how specific societies define truth at specific moments. But even inside that historical framework, he's definitely making value judgments. He consistently implies or even says outright that some knowledge systems are shoddy.
He does, especially the early human sciences. He thinks they're less rigorous than others.
And that's the real puzzle. That brings us to the core of this whole reconstruction we're doing today. How does Foucault make those kinds of normative judgments without appealing to a universal truth?
And on the flip side, what makes his own historical method, his genealogy, rigorous? How does he defend it from that same charge of just being relative?
And the argument, which I found really sophisticated and honestly surprising, it boils down to two central claims that completely reframe how you should read him.
So claim one is about his critical leverage point. The hidden standard he uses to critique the human sciences is his consistent but often kind of quiet respect for the methodological rigor of the natural and formal sciences.
Wait, really? So he's using physics and biology as his yardstick to call out sociology and psychiatry?
That's the core of it. He's not appealing to some metaphysical truth out there, but he is appealing to the gold standard of scientific rigor that developed historically in the West. It's an internal measuring stick.
That's fascinating. And the second claim?
The second claim is about his own method. The descriptive rigor of genealogy itself is solid because it's explicitly modeled on that same kind of rigorous empirical inquiry. He even calls it, very provocatively, a happy positivism.
Wow. Okay. So for you listening, the goal here is to just toss out that simple caricature of Foucault, the nihilist, the guy who says everything is just power.
Right.
Instead, we want you to see him as this really sophisticated, critical historian, one who uses the strongest rational standards available within our own tradition standards from science to expose the weakness and, frankly, the methodological fraud of other knowledge systems.
It's a completely different thinker, a much more coherent one.
Let's jump in. Section 1. Foucault's historical critique and the surprising value he places on truth-telling. Okay, so to get this, we have to unpack the intellectual lineage a bit. Foucault's project is often seen as a kind of radical historicization of Immanuel Kant's philosophy.
That's the perfect place to start. Kant asked that huge question. What are the universal, necessary, and a priori conditions that make knowledge possible for any thinking person, anywhere, anytime?
And Foucault takes that question and basically drops it right into the messiness of history.
He does. He completely shifts the project. He's not looking for these transcendental modalities anymore, things like universality or necessity. He's looking for the historical depth conditions.
He historicizes the Kantian question.
Yes, he's asking, under what specific contingent time-bound conditions does certain ideas or forms of rationality even become thinkable? He wants to expose the local cultural rules that make something seem necessary or universal to us right now.
And that focus on history immediately makes people think, okay, so he's throwing truth out the window. But the sources we're looking at really emphasize that this is not the case.
It's such a vital clarification. Foucault absolutely rejects the truth with a capital T. You know, that singular, timeless, metaphysical concept.
But that's not the same as rejecting truthfulness.
Not at all. He fiercely maintains a fundamental respect for the value of truth and the practice of truth-telling. He calls it veridiction. Getting rid of a universal truth doesn't mean you get rid of truthfulness as an ideal.
And if we look at his most famous concept, power knowledge, this distinction gets even clearer. He's not saying that power automatically distorts or blinds us to knowledge.
Exactly. That's a common misreading. If power only ever distorted knowledge, then our most powerful societies would be the most delusional, which is, well, it's clearly not true.
Think about a modern research lab or a tech company.
Right. Foucault sees power as having a fundamentally productive role, a causal role in how knowledge gets constituted. Power doesn't just repress things, it creates things. It creates the disciplinary frameworks, the research institutions, the ways of observing the world.
It creates the standards of rigor and the very rules of discourse that make certain truths possible in the first place.
Yes. So the goal isn't to say power and knowledge are enemies. The goal is to understand their relationship. Power can create the conditions for real scientific rigor just as easily as it can create conditions for, say, moralistic control that's just dressed up as science.
Okay, and to really clarify how this commitment to truth-telling drives his critique, we can break it down into two modes.
Right, using the framework from Lorenzini and Tatisila. The first mode is avowal, or what we might call confession.
And avowal is usually the target of his critique, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the history of sexuality.
Correct. Avowal refers to all those practices where individuals are sort of compelled to produce truth about themselves. Think about a psychological questionnaire, a Catholic confession, a psychiatric interview.
Things where you have to tell the truth about your inner self.
Mm-hmm. And what his genealogy does is question that powerful modern myth that being forced to confess is somehow liberating, or that where there's power, there can't be truth.
He flips it. He says sometimes the requirement to avow your truth is the most effective form of power there is. It's not about liberation, it's about classification, management, and normalization.
You've got it. The power isn't in stopping us from speaking. It's in forcing us to speak only the truths that the system is set up to hear. And in doing so, we become certain kinds of subjects.
Okay, so that's the first mode, avowal. What's the second?
The second is parrhesia. This is an ancient Greek idea. It means courageous, risky speech. Speaking truth to power, often when it could get you into a lot of trouble.
So how does parrhesia fit into Foucault's work? Is it his ideal?
It's the ideal that serves as his method of critique. It represents the possibility for the critic, or really any subject, to challenge a regime of power about its own discourses of truth. Foucault's own work, his act of digging through history to reveal the contingent, often brutal origins of systems we just take for granted.
That's an act of parrhesia.
It is. It's a form of truth-telling that disrupts the comfortable, accepted story. It forces the present to look at its own historical arbitrariness.
That distinction is so key. He uses the ideal of courageous truth-telling, parrhesia, as a weapon to dismantle these compulsory historical regimes of truth. Avowal.
Mm-hmm.
But this brings us right back to the philosophical knot. If he refuses to adopt a universal theory of truth, how does he justify saying the human sciences are weaker than the natural sciences? On what basis does he get to discriminate between these different historical truths?
That's the interpretive gap. That's the whole reason this reconstruction is necessary. He can't appeal to some external reality. He has to appeal to something immanent to history itself.
And the argument is?
The argument is that Foucault relies very heavily on historical standards of truth when he makes these normative judgments. And fundamentally, those standards are drawn directly from the natural sciences, disciplines like math, physics, biology, which he values for their incredibly high and demonstrable degree of epistemological rigor.
Okay, but hang on. Isn't that a bit hypocritical? If Foucault thinks all knowledge, science included, is born from power, how can he just exempt the methods of physics from his own critique?
That is the critical point of friction, and it's where his thinking gets really subtle. He doesn't exempt science from the critique of power. He fully accepts that scientific practices are rooted in historical power relations, but he recognizes that power is productive. Over time, those historical power relations have structured an internal system scientific methodology that has built-in mechanisms for self-correction and for empirical accountability.
Okay, so it's not that science is universally true because it perfectly mirrors reality. It's that science is simply the best, most rigorous, and self-correcting standard of rationality that the West has historically produced under the pressure of power.
You've nailed it. And that means his appeal to scientific reason isn't a betrayal of his project. It's an integral part of it. He's performing an immanent critique.
Using the system's own logic against itself.
Exactly, using the most successful, most rigorous forms of rationality that our history has developed to critique the less rigorous forms. He needs that internal, historically situated leverage point. Without it, the charge of unconstrained relativism would absolutely stick. He's constrained by historical standards, but he's choosing to be constrained by the strongest ones we have.
So to really buy this argument that Foucault is using scientific rigor as his hidden benchmark, we have to get clear on his underlying ideas about reality and knowledge. I mean, if he can't say psychiatry is wrong because reality isn't like that, then what is he saying is wrong with it?
This is where we need to understand his ontology. It's described as a discontinuous historical ontology.
And this is probably the densest philosophical part for anyone new to Foucault.
It can be. And to be fair, his own understanding evolved. Very early on, in the first preface to History of Madness, he wrote in this almost romantic way about a madness being held captive, existing in some silent, pure, primitive state.
The archaeology of silence.
Right. And that kind of implies that the discourse of psychiatry was distorting something real, something non-linguistic that was out there.
But he walked that back.
He did. He repudiated it pretty strongly later on because he recognized the metaphysical problem with it. His mature position, this discontinuous historical ontology, fundamentally rejects the idea that our discourse is just a partial or flawed representation of a non-linguistic, mind-independent reality.
So he rejects the idea that there's a real world out there just waiting for our words to describe it.
He does. So if you take an object that Foucault analyzes, like sexuality, the word doesn't point to some essential pre-existing fact about human nature. The concept of sexuality is the entire history of all the statements, the practices, the classifications, and the regulations that have been made about it.
So objects like madness or the delinquent are purely discursive constructions. They only exist and have meaning within the specific historical framework that created them.
Exactly.
Which implies a really profound logical constraint for him. If there's an irreparable break between words and things, if language constructs its objects instead of just mirroring them, then he can't appeal to those non-linguistic things to say a discourse is wrong.
He can't. He cannot say psychology is wrong because it doesn't match the way reality actually is. He is completely constrained to analyzing the internal coherence and methodological rigor of the discourse itself.
So when he uses words like things or reality in his later work,
it's best to read it as a kind of rhetorical device. A way to distinguish his radical approach from conventional realism. He's saying, look at the actual facts that this discourse produces, but you have to understand that those facts are historical, discursive facts, not facts of nature.
Which makes his turn to Nietzsche so important, because Nietzsche gives him a way to talk about how things emerge historically without having to talk about some mythical, pure origin.
Precisely. He borrows heavily from Nietzsche here, distinguishing between the metaphysical origin, the Ursprung, and the historical emergence, the Entstehung. The search for an origin is always a search for some perfect, foundational moment of truth or purity.
Which Foucault completely rejects.
He rejects it entirely. He rejects the idea that knowledge began with some pristine moment of pure perception, of just seeing the world as it is.
So for him, knowledge is just an artifact.
It's an artifact, completely immanent to history. It's something that was invented for practical, strategic purposes, not something that was discovered through objective sight. Knowledge isn't a reflection of a deeper reality. It's a tool that was forged in historical struggles.
And this is where that really powerful and frankly unsettling phrase comes from. Foucault's claim that knowledge is not made for understanding, but for cutting.
That might be the most radical thing he ever said about human inquiry. It suggests that our search for knowledge isn't fundamentally motivated by some pure Platonic desire for objective truth.
It's not about understanding for its own sake.
No, it's a tool motivated by self-interest, by practical concerns, by strategy. It is for cutting, which means for interpretation, for analysis, for division, for control. It's a very dark, very strategic view of what truth is for.
Can you give a practical example of that cutting, like in the context of the prison system from Discipline and Punish?
Sure. Before the 19th century, punishment was mostly a public spectacle. It was about targeting the body to show the sovereign's power. The knowledge system around crime was all about retribution.
Right.
Then, power relations shifted, and the new discourses, penology, criminology, they weren't invented to understand crime better in some universal way. They were invented as a practical tool, as a cut, to analyze and divide the population, to manage labor, to standardize social deviation. That new knowledge enabled a new, much more efficient kind of power. Knowledge was a strategic weapon, not a pure revelation.
Which links directly back to this idea of the will to know versus the will to power. If our knowledge is always born from these situated struggles, then our quest for truth is really just a disguised version of the will to power.
Yes, and since inquiry is always born from interests, Foucault argues that what we end up with is often a truth that is error, lie, illusion.
And there's that nihilist charge again. If all knowledge is born this way, if it's all just error and illusion, how does he salvage any concept of legitimate truth?
Right. How does he define what he calls the truthful truth, without falling back into that correspondence theory he rejects?
What's the move?
The key is this. The truthful truth is not defined by its correspondence to an external, mind-independent reality. It is defined as the product of our most rigorous and successful epistemic norms.
Okay, so it's about the process, not the outcome matching reality.
It's about the rigor of the process. The truthful truth is what you get when you apply the standards: empirical accountability, internal coherence, self-correction, technical success, that have historically proven themselves to be the most robust and effective.
So he's looking at the history of Western rationality itself, and he's taking its greatest achievements in terms of method, the successful practices of science, and using them to critique the areas where that rationality, frankly, failed to achieve rigor.
That's the essential insight. He's critiquing the places where it was most obviously influenced by immediate political or moral interests.
And the big implication here is that any critique, any improvement of our standards has to be immanent. It has to come from within the discursive practices it wants to describe.
Yes. And that is the philosophical move that allows Foucault to draw on accepted, historically validated standards of rationality, like the methods of the natural sciences, to question the legitimacy of other fields, like the human sciences, without needing to appeal to some universal metaphysical yardstick that exists outside of history.
Okay, so that philosophical framework is now solid. We get it. Foucault uses the rigorous standards from science imminently to expose the weaknesses of other fields. Now, let's drill down into the actual evidence. Where does this respect for science come from, and how do we see him actually using it in his major historical studies?
Right, this takes us to section 3, the force of scientific truth. And Foucault wasn't thinking in a vacuum. His appreciation for scientific epistemology is really deeply rooted in a particular French intellectual tradition.
The history and philosophy of the sciences.
Exactly. Figures like Gaston Bachelard, Georges Canguilhem, Jean Cavalier.
And this tradition is pretty different from the Anglo-American way of doing philosophy of science, isn't it?
Oh, very different. This French historical epistemology gives scientific methodology a kind of privileged, rigorous status. It's a tradition that fully accepts that scientific concepts are historical products. They're shaped by contingent factors, by subtle norms. They reject the idea of eternal truth.
But they still see scientific practice as the highest standard of rationality we've got.
They do, primarily because of its self-correcting nature. For them, knowledge is always provisional, always subject to revision. It probably contains some error, but that very provisionality is its greatest epistemological strength.
So they're radical historicists about science, but they're still huge defenders of its rigor.
You've got it. And Foucault performs what you'd call a historico-critical appropriation of this tradition. So while Bachelard and Kangelhem were more interested in traditional epistemology judging, when a concept crosses the technical threshold of scientificity, Foucault is doing a genealogy.
He's focused on the historical conditions of possibility. Okay, let's clarify that distinction, the two thresholds. What does it mean for a discourse to cross that threshold of scientificity versus the level Foucault is focused on, which is epistemologization?
So the threshold of scientificity is the big one. That's when a body of knowledge moves beyond just basic verification and coherence and establishes really rigorous, self-contained axiomatic rules. Think modern physics, advanced biology. That's the realm of true science.
Okay.
Foucault, especially in his earlier archaeological phase, was more interested in the level below that, the level of epistemologization.
Which means he's looking at the moment a discourse gets just enough structure to start looking like knowledge. The moment it gets basic rules for verification and coherence and starts to gain cultural authority.
Even if it hasn't achieved genuine scientific rigor yet. Precisely. He's analyzing how certain fields, particularly the human sciences, built up enough of a framework to seem like knowledge, to get political power, without ever truly crossing that higher threshold of rigor that the natural sciences demand.
And this is how he builds his hierarchy of knowledge.
It is. Foucault clearly affirms that the natural and formal sciences have this profound methodological core of rigor. And it comes from two key features: empirical accountability and a self-correcting orientation.
They have to check their theories against observable phenomena.
Constantly. And they have built-in mechanisms, peer review, replication, public testing, to refine or just throw out theories that don't hold up.
And having that clear standard is what lets him go after the human sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, which he pretty much declares are not sciences at all.
They're his target because they've gained immense cultural authority, the power to classify people, to judge them, to normalize them. And they've done it through a false claim to being scientific. They borrow the prestige of science without doing the hard, rigorous, self-correcting work.
And that feigned connection is where political and moral agendas can hide most effectively.
It's their deepest disguise.
Okay, let's go to the books, because this is where his normative judgments are laid bare. Let's start with the critique of sexuality in the Will to Knowledge.
Right. In Volume 1 of The History of Sexuality, he's not arguing that sex isn't real. He's arguing that the modern discourse around it, this obsession with confession, classification, pathology, is just methodologically weak. He explicitly calls it out for systematically ignoring the robust, rigorous insights from disciplines like reproductive physiology and biology.
He literally said the epistemological content of all the sexology was feeble compared to biology, which followed a general scientific normativity.
He did. He pointed out that the pathologization of sexuality, the invention of categories like the pervert or the homosexual, was driven by political and moral interests. Things like regulating the population, managing the family, maintaining bourgeois norms.
And those interests were just dressed up in scientific language.
They were. And the conceptual weakness was obvious because it didn't align with the more rigorous, empirically accountable findings of mainstream biology. In comparison, biology had a much stronger armature of scientific practice. Foucault basically used biology as a foil to expose the political function hiding inside all that talk about sex.
The judgment is crystal clear. Biology is methodologically superior. Okay, let's look at the comparison he makes between medicine and psychiatry in The Birth of the Clinic. That one's fascinating.
It's a really subtle but vital distinction. Foucault shows how modern medicine developed under these very contingent historical conditions, all about the reorganization of the hospital, the doctor's gaze. But, and this is the key part, he largely accepts medicine's basic epistemic credibility.
Why?
Because the modern anatomical concept of disease that came out of it was empirically accountable. It had a much stronger armature, as he put it. It relied on autopsy, on systematic observation, on classifying physical lesions. It was grounded in the physical body in a way that early psychiatry wasn't.
So even though medical practice is wrapped up in social structures and power, who gets treated where, how its methodological standards give it a higher degree of protection from just being arbitrary.
Absolutely. The power relations in medicine were productive and causal. They helped generate a rigorous, empirically successful system. The concepts in early psychiatry, by contrast, were often based on much less rigorous frameworks, mixing up moral judgments with medical words. Foucault is implicitly saying medicine got much closer to real scientificity than psychiatry did.
And the figure of the delinquent in Discipline and Punish is another perfect example of this fake scientificity.
It really is. The delinquent is a total historical invention. Before the 19th century, you had prisoners, criminals, people who broke a law. The delinquent is a new kind of person, someone whose entire life story is understood through the lens of their abnormality, their danger to society.
Even before they actually commit a crime.
Right. And this new category was constructed using these very dubious ideas of normality that came from the baby human sciences, like criminology and psychology.
And the whole carceral system, the prisons, the observation, the idea of reform, it drew its authority from the supposed connection to science.
That's the mechanism. That's an illegitimate authority. Foucault shows how the rise of the carceral system happened at the exact same time as the birth of scientific psychology. The system used the cultural authority and prestige of science to justify its total surveillance and normalization, but the concepts it was using.
Abnormality, moral defect, personality tests.
They all lacked genuine scientific normativity. They just couldn't meet the standards of empirical rigor that something like chemistry or even anatomy had already achieved.
Let's touch on his early work on mental illness one more time, because he makes the comparison so explicitly there.
He does. In books like Mental Illness and Psychology, his whole argument is that mental pathology fails to meet the standards of conceptual rigor you find in organic pathology. He says concepts from psychiatry like personality or adaptation are just too fuzzy. They lack the precise testable definitions that concepts like organism or lesion have in medical science.
He called the supposed objectivity of psychiatry a reification of a magical type.
Yes, rooted in morality and social norms, but then covered over by the myth of scientific objectivity.
It's such a consistent pattern. In every major work, you see him applying these benchmarks of methodological rigor, of empirical accountability, the internal standards of natural science, to expose the structural weaknesses and political origins of the human sciences.
And that's the synthesis. Scientificity is always imminent to power. It's historical, it's contingent. But because power is productive, it's totally possible to establish rigorous epistemic constraints inside that field of power. Foucault's genius is in mapping that continuum. He puts the natural sciences at the strong, self-correcting end, and then exposes the human sciences for claiming that rigor without actually doing the work.
Okay, we've established that Foucault uses rigorous scientific standards to critique other fields, but now we have to ask the final, absolutely critical question. What standards does he use to validate his own historical work?
Right.
This moves us into our last section, genealogical positivism and descriptive rigor.
And to justify his own empirical claims, that the delinquent was invented this way, that sexuality was constructed that way, Foucault says something incredibly provocative. He says, the genealogical mood will be that of a happy positivism.
That phrase is a minefield. I mean, given how much he critiques the ideology of traditional positivism, to call his own method a form of positivism seems like he's deliberately trying to start a fight.
It is entirely provocative, but he means it in a very specific, very qualified sense. What he means is that genealogy models itself on rigorous empirical inquiry. It adopts an approach that is empirically accountable, fallibilist, historically reflexive, and self-correcting.
So it's structured to resemble scientific practice.
In a way, yes. It's operating as a rigorous empirical enterprise that holds itself accountable to evidence.
How does it work in practice?
Well, genealogy generates hypotheses about how discursive structures were formed. For instance, it might hypothesize about the rules that govern what a doctor could say in 1800. And then it scrutinizes those hypotheses against the historico-discursive evidence you can find through meticulous archival research.
So it's accountable to the historical record in the same way that a natural science is accountable to experimental results.
That's the analogy. It challenges these grand, sweeping metaphysical theories by rigorously testing them against the archive, not by just rejecting them out of hand.
But let's be super clear about how this is different from the 19th century positivism he hated. That traditional positivism, the kind you associate with Comte, was often dogmatic and, frankly, naive.
Totally. Foucault explicitly rejected those 18th and 19th century forms of positivism and scientism. He blasted them for imposing this universal myth of scientific objectivity while being totally blind to their own normative, historically contingent foundations.
He called it pre-critical naivete.
He did, because it tried to ground truth in empirical facts without ever asking about the historical conditions that made those facts intelligible to begin with.
The traditional positivists suffered from what philosophers call givenism. They just assumed the facts were given by reality, just sitting there waiting to be described, and they ignored all the complicated historical work that went into defining what even counts as a relevant fact.
Absolutely. His critique of how madness was medicalized is a perfect example. He showed that the so-called objectivity of early psychiatry was often just a moral tactic, a set of asylum rituals that later got covered over by the myth of scientific objectivity preached by the positivists. Foucault's positivism completely rejects that kind of givenism.
So his genealogical positivism is defined by replacing the search for some metaphysical origin with an analysis of actual historical events.
Yes. Instead of the quest for universal origins, he substitutes the analysis of historical emergence. He substitutes the analysis of rarity for the search for totalities, meaning he focuses on the specificity of an event, not on trying to make it fit some grand, seamless story.
And he swaps the search for a transcendental foundation with the description of relations of exteriority.
Which is just a fancy way of saying he looks at how concepts are formed through their contingent relationships with institutions, with architecture, with power. It's a very qualified, historically grounded positivism.
Okay, so it's modeled on empirical inquiry, but genealogy is not a science. What are the key limits that keep it distinct?
There are three fundamental differences. First, the subject matter is totally different. Genealogy deals with discursive events, statements, utterances, the rules of what can be said. It doesn't deal with natural events or non-linguistic facts. He's studying the archive, not the universe.
Second, a huge part of the natural sciences rigor is experimentation.
Exactly. Genealogy lacks that rigorous experimental dimension. You can't run a controlled, repeatable experiment on a historical context. The methods for verification are archival and interpretive, not experimental.
And third, because history is so complex and contingent, the very breaks and discontinuities he's mapping, genealogy can't predict the future.
It openly admits that. It has no predictive power. He's a historian looking backward to analyze how we got here, not a scientist trying to predict where we're going. These constraints mean genealogy can't claim the same kind of veracity as, say, physics, but it can still maintain descriptive rigor.
Which brings us back one last time to that critical challenge. The worry that if he rejects reality as a benchmark and relies on interpretation, he can't justify his historical facts and just falls back into relativism. How does he secure that descriptive rigor?
This is where the idea of interpretive analytics comes in, a term from Dreyfus and Rabineau. Foucault realized, especially after writing The Archaeology of Knowledge, that the idea of a pure description was impossible. The genealogist is always already situated inside the very field of power knowledge that they're analyzing.
So the historian can't be a neutral, objective observer standing outside of it all.
No, not possible. Therefore, to secure rigor, genealogy has to be an immanent critique. It has to draw on the rigorous existing epistemic standards within the Enlightenment tradition, the standards that come from scientific empiricism and historical accountability, to interpret the archive and to call other weaker standards into question.
Okay, so Foucault's work is rigorous because it holds itself to the highest standards of historical accountability available. The evidence has to be verifiable in the archive, and the logic he uses to interpret that evidence has to conform to the historically strongest standards of rationality we have.
That's the entire defense. The empirical basis of his work, which is accountable to historical records, gives it a descriptive rigor that protects his insights from just being crude distortions. His method is grounded in interpretation, yes, but it is not unconstrained. It's constrained by evidence, by history, and by an appeal to the highest standards of rationality that history has produced.
So genealogy is the process of using those established scientific standards to expose the areas where power is just masquerading as science.
Specifically within the human sciences, yes.
Mm.
So to just summarize this really nuanced synthesis, we've basically moved Foucault away from that unfair label of being a nihilist or a relativist. And we've done it by establishing two core claims that really define his methodological coherence.
Right. First, Foucault's critical leverage point, his standard for judgment, is secured by drawing on the rigorous, self-correcting standards of the natural sciences. Things like empirical accountability and fallibilism. He uses those to make normative judgments about the profound epistemological weakness of the human sciences.
He uses the best of historical reason to critique the worst of it.
Exactly. And second, the descriptive rigor of his own genealogical method is secured because it models itself on that same empirical accountability to historical evidence. It embraces that happy positivism, which rigorously tests historical hypotheses against the archive.
While at the same time rejecting the dogmatic, naive givenism of traditional positivism.
Right, so the sophisticated Foucault, the one we've hopefully unpacked today, is not a thinker who just reduces everything to power. He's a critical historian who maps a whole continuum of knowledge strength. He identifies genuine rigor in empirically accountable practices, and he uses those standards imminently to expose the political construction and often the moralistic foundations of disciplines that claim the authority of science without meeting its standards.
And this whole deep dive, I think, leaves us with a really provocative final question for you to think about. If all our knowledge systems are only provisionally true and are always subject to historical revision, and if our best, most rigorous standards today were themselves formed under the contingent pressures of power relations,
then what existing standards of rationality or methodological assumptions do we rely on today without even realizing that they might be the very tools used to critique us, to expose our own historical arbitrariness 50 or 100 years from now?
something to mull over.
Definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.